So thank you all so much for joining us for Armchair Travel to Panama with the Traveling Librarian. Join Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for his newest Armchair Travel presentation. This monthly series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. And this month, we're traveling to Panama City, the capital of Panama, a vibrant seaside metropolis blending modern skyscrapers with historic neighborhoods. It's a gateway to the famous Panama Canal, a world famous engineering marvel. Casco Viejo, the city's colonial quarter, boasts cobblestone streets and lively plazas, and the city is also ringed by lush rainforests and stunning beaches that often rich biodiversity and adventure opportunities. I feel like I missed a word in there, but I apologize. So Jeff is the retired head of reference services at the Lucius Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, and he's an avid traveler and photographer. And I again want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring. So all 100 of us who are watching live and the many, many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us today. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks everybody for having me back again. I see a lot of names I recognize. Um, what was I going to say? As Robert said, feel free to pop questions in the chat or preferably the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that as we go through the program. And if I can answer them as we go along, that'll be great. And if not, if I miss any, I'll stick around at the end and we can catch up with any questions afterwards. I'm going to share my screen. I can remember where that is. There we go. And we will get started. This is a trip I did actually very recently. It was only in, February? When was I there? February, just a few weeks ago, actually, 2 months. And I have to start this program by saying that about 50 years ago, probably when I was like in fifth grade, I remember doing when you're a kid in elementary school, you have to do those programs, those projects on. You pick a country and you have to do things. And back in those days, we used poster board and had to do a oral presentation with visual aids and all that kind of thing. Well, I did that, and I got stuck with Panama. I shouldn't say stuck with. It was interesting. I learned a lot about Panama. Who knew that it would take me 50 years to actually go to Panama in person and see the things that I was talking about? And of course, it's changed a lot in those 50 years. We're going to talk about that. But the first thing I always like to do with my programs is to put the place on the map. And that's particularly important for Panama because it's all about geography. This country is all about where it's located and how it's what its geology and geography is like. It's been the focus of foreign power for centuries, mainly Spain, Britain, France, and the US primarily. On this particular slide, I've shown you I'm overlaying Massachusetts because that's where many of us are, just to give you a rough idea of how big the country is. It's not very large geographically. It's also not very large in terms of population, only about 4.3 million people or so. So like half of the number of people who live in Massachusetts. And most of those, at least half of them, live in the area around, right here in the middle, around the canal zone, where the capital, Panama City, is, and Colon, which is the large port on the Caribbean side, the Atlantic side. They use dollars. If you travel there, you will just use American dollars. Technically, they use a currency called the Balboa, but it's pegged to the US dollar. So they don't actually produce bills, they only produce coins. So you can take American currency there and spend that. If you get any change back, you'll get Balboa coins. But it's kind of interesting to be in a place where there seems to be this mix of American and foreign. Of course, they speak Spanish as well. But I need to talk a little bit about the geography here. We're going to focus today on the area that I visited, which was really only here. There's enormous parts of the country with tropical forests and beautiful beaches and other places to explore. Someday, maybe I'll go back and do those. But today, we're going to focus mostly on the area around the capital, Panama City, and the canal area. Um, the capital is on the Pacific, very close to the canal entrance, which you can see here. And it stretches about 15 miles all the way up the coast to the international airport here. But the geography is weird, and you don't really notice it until you're there. When you are in the capital here, I stayed in the old town, which is this area right here. If you look straight east um, from Panama City, you will see the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean, which is very strange to get used to, particularly for those of us on the east coast of the United States, where the sun is supposed to rise over the Atlantic. But because of the way Panama snakes around, you're actually going to see the sunrise in the east over the Pacific Ocean. I want to point out a couple of things here. The airport is way off in the distance, but a couple of places that we're going to talk about are Panama Viejo, Old Panama, which is the first settlement that occurred. We're going to visit that. And then that was destroyed by pirates, and they moved the settlement a couple of years later to what is now the old part of the city, the colonial part of the city here called Casco Viejo. And in between the two, stretching along this long area below the hills, is the modern city, which is full of skyscrapers. As you fly into Panama, you're going to see a very lush green landscape of jungle. It's very tropical there. We're not all the way down to the equator, but we're getting close to it. So it's pretty much the same climate all year round, although there is a rainy season and a dry season. The best time to travel to Panama is the dry season from December to April, roughly. Fortunately, Panama is south enough that it doesn't tend to get hit much by hurricanes in the Caribbean. They also are a little bit out of the earthquake zone. They have them on occasion, but it's for earthquakes and hurricanes, it's a relatively safe part of the Caribbean. You won't get much of that there. But the temperature is in the 80s, at least the 80s, almost all year long. And the humidity is also very high, particularly in the wet season, which runs through, say, May through October, November. It rains almost continuously through that time period. So definitely the best time to be there is in our winter and early spring. There's been tremendous growth over the past century or so. This is a pair of images from one of the museums I visited that show you the incredible difference from 1907, which is the time period when the canal was being built, to, and there were only about 50,000 people in Panama City at that point, to now, actually about 15 years ago here, where you can see skyscrapers in a completely different environment in the 21st century, where we now have about 2 million people living in the area around the capital. I stayed in the historic colonial city in a sort of industrial chic hotel. You can see it here. They even had these weird, in the lobby, they had these weird sort of furry chairs. And my hotel room, if you lay in bed and look up, I had this industrial chic look with elegant lamps over me. The old city, I think, of all the parts of the city that you could possibly stay in, I would recommend the old city just because it's the most attractive, it's very pedestrian friendly, and it has a very nice concentration of stores and restaurants. It's a very safe part of the city. There's a lot to do, a lot to see, and the architecture is very traditional and very beautiful. There are some areas in the modern city, well, I'll show you those a little bit later, that are also very popular for tourists to stay, but I found it a little bit sterile. They're mostly international skyscraper hotels, and although they're very nice in terms of amenities, I found the neighborhood just didn't appeal to me quite as much. So I would recommend the old city. I'm going to take you through kind of chronologically the history of the city. And we're going to start in Panama Viejo, which is quite a few miles from where I was staying, about 10 miles or so up the coast. Panama Viejo was the first capital of the city, founded in 1519, and in fact, it was the first European settlement on the Pacific coast of the New World. This is a model from the museum, and now you can visit it. It is a UNESCO heritage site, World Heritage Site, and this model shows kind of what it looked like at that time period. So we're back in the 1600s. There was a fortress that protected the city, and you can see a very typical Spanish colonial settlement. What happened was the pirate Henry Morgan, he was Welsh, and along with various other people like Sir Walter Raleigh and other European explorers came to the New World, and Henry Morgan destroyed the entire settlement here, burned it to the ground in the year 1671. So now really there's nothing much left there except ruins, but it's a fascinating place to visit to see where the origins of Panama City came from. And this is in that area looking back towards some of the skyscrapers in the newest part of the city. You'll notice we're looking at mudflats, and that's because on the Pacific side of Panama, there are fairly significant tides, 20 feet or more. So you're looking at mudflats at low tide when the tide goes out quite far from the coast. It's completely different from the Atlantic Caribbean side where the tides are minimal, only a couple of feet. And that's going to become important later when we talk about the canal. If you walk along the stretch of coastline that from the entrance to this historic site down to where the ruins are, you get a beautiful view out over the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, to the causeway that wraps around the coastline about maybe a mile off the coast. And there's beautiful bird watching because there's all kinds of seabirds in this area. Most of the site, as I said at this point, is ruins. All you're going to see is a few ruined foundations. This is one of the few exceptions. This is in kind of plausible shape. This is an old convent from the 1600s. Also beautiful trees. There are gardens. It's a nice place to get some shade if you want to stroll around and enjoy the sunshine, but without getting too hot. You'll see very typical jungle vegetation that thrives in a very humid climate. These are bromeliads that that grow on tree branches and absorb moisture directly from the air. Banyan trees, fig trees. And there's a lot to see here in terms of ruins. This is the ruins of the cathedral, of which really only the foundation and the tower remain. So this was the main church for this settlement. And unusually, this tower was at the end where the altar is, which is not the typical way to build a church. Usually the towers are at the main, the western entrance. And looking from, you can go up to the top of the tower, which is nice because you get a great view around and you can see the plan of the cathedral. This is the former nave. And you also get a really nice view over the entire historic site, as well as the museum. This modern building down here is a very nice, small but very well put together museum of the history of the city of Panama and the history of these ruins. Almost every one of the sites here, every one of the buildings has really well done signs in both English and Spanish that explain with a model, a reconstruction, what this particular place looked like at the time of the devastation of the settlement in the late 1600s. At the height of this settlement, there were about 10,000 people living here. Even before Henry Morgan, the pirate, came in and destroyed everything, they had also had other problems like a major earthquake. There was a fire in the 17th century. So it certainly had a lot of issues over the years. But the museum is well worth visiting. They have excellent exhibitions. It's also air conditioned, which is kind of nice if it's a hot day out. And as you stroll back to the entrance, you'll see an amazing variety of bird life. The biodiversity in Panama is incredible, and even right downtown in the city, you're likely to see a lot of interesting things. On the right is a bittern wandering around the mudflats, and I had to look up the sort of hawk eagle thing that was on the left. It turns out it's a yellow-headed caracara, and I saw several of them right, only 10 or 20 feet from me sitting in a tree. Very beautiful birds. There's iguanas all over the place, which is probably not a surprise, and the typical kind of birds that you will see in any tropical area: herons, egrets, ibis, and so forth. So that particular historic site is a very good way to get an introduction to the earliest history of the city. The next place that you should visit, even if you're not actually staying there, is where they moved the capital about 2 years after the Casco Panama Viejo was destroyed by fire by the pirates. They moved it in 1673 to this little peninsula that's about 10 miles southwest. And it is now the focus of the historic part of the city. This is definitely a Spanish colonial city, very typical of the kinds that you'll find all over Central and South America. It's also very close to the river mouth. It was built there because there was a river here with access to fresh water and springs, where a little bit further to the west, you can't see it on this map, but the modern Panama Canal goes through. This weird thing that you see around on the outside that rings the city is called the Cinto Costera, or part of it. And it's a 3-kilometer elevated causeway, which I suppose you could say is a little ugly. It's basically an elevated highway that allows you to circumvent the historic city. But the good thing is it means that there's no highway cutting the city off from the rest of the neighborhoods. And it actually makes a very nice walk. I'll show you this a little bit later. There are pedestrian and bike paths all the way around this. And it makes about a 3-kilometer circuit with great views of the old city. The old city, to show you on an earlier map, a very old map, this is turned 90 degrees to match the previous map, but you can see it's a very typical Spanish colonial city with a grid pattern, and in the middle, a major plaza, which is where the government buildings, the cathedral would have been, and completely surrounding it would be the fortifications and walls that protected the city from both the land side and the seaside. And the reason I recommend staying in this part of town is just because it's a beautiful historic center where a lot of historic buildings have been turned into elegant restaurants, very nice boutique hotels, beautiful colonial architecture. Although much of that gentrification is kind of recent. So I wouldn't say this area is completely Disneyfied. You can still see buildings that are kind of in need of help. There's some graffiti. But overall, it's just a beautiful place to stroll around. Almost every hotel or restaurant in this neighborhood has a rooftop bar where you can get some delicious cocktails, listen to music, and watch the sun set and watch the lights come on over the city. And there's a number of historic monuments and museums in the old center. This one is one of the many churches. It's called the Church of La Merced, Mercy. I happened to be there. The Rolls Royce that you can see over on the right is because there was a wedding going on when I happened to stop in. So I just sneaked a peek from the back row. And the doors are, again, most of these churches are from the 17th, 18th century. So they definitely have that beautiful colonial historical look. But there's a mix of buildings there. There's a variety of Art Deco buildings, Art Nouveau buildings, 19th century buildings. Some of it is a little gentrified, which is good for the economics, but can be a little pricey, certainly for the locals. I love this place. I did not eat here. This restaurant called El Enigma is not just a restaurant, it's a gastronomic enigma experience. I tried to find out how much it actually costs to eat there, and they don't list the prices on their website. So that tells you a little bit about what you can expect to pay. But there's plenty of places to eat in Casco Viejo that are there's street food. There's very inexpensive restaurants as well. Lots of typical architecture like this. Many of the buildings are very colorful, which is typical of Central and South America. I particularly liked this corner where there was a red, white, and blue building right next to each other, which are the colors of the Panamanian flag. Many of them have balconies and very high ceilings, which of course is appropriate for a tropical and very humid climate. The high ceilings help ameliorate a little bit of the heat, and the balconies allow you to be outside and extend a little bit of space out over the street. But it's just a joy to stroll around the neighborhoods in the old city and have a drink, stop for some food, have some lunch. More than one of the churches in the old district are actually in ruins for various reasons, usually fire or earthquake at some point. This one, which was never rebuilt, is now used for functions. You can get married there and have your reception there. But there's some beautiful municipal buildings as well. In the main square, which is called Independence Plaza, this is the main municipal square where you'll find the cathedral and also the government buildings. This is the municipal building, the Consejo Municipal, which is essentially the city hall of Panama, if you will. And right next door is what used to be a luxury hotel that was built in the 18th century. And then during the time period, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, during the time period when the French originally came in the mid to late 19th century to try to build the canal, they took over this building as the canal administration. This is where their offices were. Since then, it has been completely converted into a Panama Canal museum, and I would highly recommend visiting this if you have any interest in the history and the engineering of the canal, because it's an absolutely superb museum that covers not only the time period in the 19th and early 20th centuries when it was built, but the history right up until the present day through the treaties under the Carter administration and the transfer of the canal zone back to Panama in 1999 and things that have happened since then. It's an absolutely excellent museum and a highlight, I think, of any visit to the city. The other thing right next to it is the Metropolitan Cathedral, one of the older ones in Central America. It started in 1688, but it took a whole 100 years to finish it. Very typical Spanish colonial style. And of course, the interior is also beautiful. It has this is a later altarpiece from the 19th century with elaborate decorations. And I found this decidedly weird statue of this is the infant Saint John and infant Saint Joseph playing together. Certainly one of the weirder sculptures I've seen in a Catholic church. There's a number of other important buildings and monuments around here, the Palacio de Gobierno, a number of important hotels, and you can walk all the way around the perimeter of this old part of the city that has amazing views back to the newest part of the city where all the skyscrapers are. And you can also see that elevated highway that runs around the edge as well. If you look to the other direction, to the west, you can see the mouth of the Panama Canal, which is very close to the city. We're going to see that close up later when we actually take a boat trip through the canal. This is the Bridge of the Americas, which was the first of the bridges to be built over the canal. The old city has plenty of pedestrianized streets where you can get great food, different restaurants to eat at, and of course, lots and lots of shops where you can buy crafts or Panama hats, which are probably the most popular thing to buy there. I should point out, though, a little tidbit to know about Panama hats is they're not actually from Panama. They're from Ecuador. But back when the canal was being built, President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, the first one, made a visit to Panama at the start of the construction of the canal. And he wore one of these hats, which the style came from Ecuador. But because of his visit and the connection to Panama, um, for the 100 some odd years since then, now the hats are pretty much inextricably connected with Panama, and are called Panama hats, even though originally they had nothing to do with Panama. And you can thank Teddy Roosevelt for that. And if you want to buy one, it's hard to walk 50 feet in Panama City without seeing a store that sells them. Here's another one of the ruined churches, which is now a very pleasant little park. A few blocks away, the other big plaza in the old city is called Plaza Simón Bolívar, which has a massive Franciscan church in it, and next to it is the Palacio Bolívar, which now you can see in this picture. This houses the foreign ministry. There's a number of government buildings here, including the presidential palace. And on the opposite side of the square is this fantastic hotel, which has a very swanky restaurant that I treated myself to a couple days later. I happened to be there entirely by accident. I did not plan this trip around all of the political hoo-ha that's happened since our new administration here in the United States. And totally by coincidence, I arrived on the same day that Marco Rubio, our new Secretary of State, appeared there. So not surprisingly, there was a lot of patriotism going on in Panama because over the canal, and the Panamanian flag, which you can see here, it was literally everywhere. I don't think I saw a square inch of Panama that did not have Panamanian flags all over it. So there was a lot of pride. You may wonder what, as an American, it was like to travel there, given the political stuff that was going on. And it was actually very interesting to talk to a lot of people there. I had no problems as an American. But I did find that my discussions with people over the politics of the canal and the new administration in America and so forth, there was a very distinct difference in understanding from the locals between Americans who might travel there for vacation or work or as expats who live there, and the American government. They saw a very distinct difference between those. So I had some great conversations with people about the current situation and where things might go and so forth. In that same square or close by, this is a statue of Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was the main driving force between the French attempt to build a canal in the 19th century. He was famous not only for that endeavor, but previous to that, he had built the Suez Canal. So he was, at that time, he was known as Mr. Canal, and that's why they looked to him to build the Panama Canal, although from the French experience didn't turn out so well. We'll talk about that. There is also a very nice monument in the middle to Simón Bolívar. And the tower that you can see behind, I went back on a much prettier day. The weather cleared up after my first day. And this confection that you can see here is the Church of Francis of Assisi, a Franciscan church from the 18th century. And you can, the interior of the church is kind of modern. It's pretty, but mostly a more modern interpretation. But the highlight of visiting this church, if you don't mind heights, is to climb the bell tower for fantastic views over the city. In all directions. This is looking north to the new city, and again back towards that square, down to the Plaza Bolivar, the cathedral you can see just off in the distance to the left. I'm going to talk about, and we'll visit that bump off in the distance very shortly. And it's just a beautiful view over the historic part of the city that really has not changed very much at all over the last, say, 200 years or so. This is looking off towards the west, towards the canal entrance, and out towards the Amador port and causeway, which we'll also visit in just a minute. So it's worth it to wait. I think it cost $5 to go up to the top. And the views are breathtaking. And try to plan it on a day when the weather is nice because here you can actually see the staircase that goes up. So it's not for people who don't like heights, but it's well worth it if you like views. Very close by is another major building. This is the National Theater, designed in 1904. And another church that I kind of just stumbled on. This turned out to be, I think, my favorite church, even though it was probably in the worst condition. It's the Church of San Jose. Very noteworthy, but a bit run down. It could use some fixing up. It was built in 1673, right at the founding of this new settlement after the burning of the old one. And it's known for its incredibly gorgeous mahogany altarpiece, which you can see here on the left, painted in gold. And this altarpiece was actually in a church in Panama Viejo, the original settlement that was burned by the pirates. And the story behind it is that when they were under attack, they painted this altarpiece black. The idea being that the pirates would think it was not of any particular value and they wouldn't touch it, which is what ended up happening. So after the city was destroyed, fortunately, the altarpiece was saved and they moved it to this church in the newer settlement and restored it by removing all the black paint and regilding it. So now it has this incredibly beautiful look in this little church that a lot of people don't necessarily visit. I, of course, need to talk about food because I always need to talk about food. And I ate, the hotel that I stayed in had a wonderful restaurant right immediately next door. And I had ceviche, delicious. I'm a big fan of ceviche, and they had excellent seafood there. That's not a surprise given the location. Panama has lots of very good seafood. And the chips that you can see next to it, those are plantains. They're called patacones. And they're fried plantain. Actually, they're twice fried plantain chips. So plantains, as you probably know, are kind of like bananas. They're in the same family, but not quite as sweet. And these are incredibly crispy and make a nice accompaniment. Here's some, again, strolling a little bit around the old city in slightly better weather. They have wonderful views of the new city. There's a lot of places that will sell crafts, all manner of local crafts, some of which are kind of tacky, some of which are actually really very beautiful. This stall is selling local embroidery, which is called mola, a style of textile which is very traditional for the indigenous tribes of Panama. And if you like this kind of embroidery, there is actually a mola museum. I didn't end up having time to go there, where the entire museum is dedicated to this particular, the history and different styles of this kind of textile work. And just more nicely restored buildings all the way around the old city. If you leave the old town, you can get a nice view looking back to it. And the only really tall things you'll see are the church towers. The view really has not changed very much, as I said, for the past couple hundred years. And you can start here with what's called the Cinta Costera, which is a promenade for both walkers and cyclists. It starts in the old town and goes for several miles all the way through the new city. You'll see a large number of Panamanian flags here. And some really nice views right along the coast. You go by the old fishing port, the Mercado de Mariscos, which is well worth a stop. And it goes all day. It's best early in the morning, which is when the fishermen put out their catch. But pretty much all day long, you will find all manner of fish. Even if you have no intention of buying anything, it's kind of like a museum of fish. You can walk around and see stuff, and you can also eat. There's a number of really fresh and very cheap seafood restaurants that a lot of the locals eat at in this area. This is the working port, which you can see is at low tide, so all the fishing boats are left high and dry. But it's a great place to spend an hour or so just wandering around and seeing what's on offer. I want to talk a little bit about some other neighborhoods that are near here, which are not necessarily visited by tourists. This is the area again where we were just visiting the historic center, which is this little peninsula that sticks out. But immediately next to it are two neighborhoods. This is called El Chorillo, and just above it, this neighborhood here is called Santa Ana, and they lie in between the old city and the hill of Ancon, which we're going to visit in a little bit. They are among the most dangerous in terms of crime areas of the city, and tourists are usually warned to stay very far away from them. And it's kind of ironic that they are immediately next to the very lovely gentrified historic district. These were areas that were originally built as neighborhoods with housing for canal workers 100 and some odd years ago. So if you read any of the tourist guides, you will be warned to stay away from these areas. I found that that's a little bit overblown, but you should still be very careful. I wouldn't go there at night, but they are definitely neighborhoods that are changing. And I ended up taking a walking tour, which I found interesting because there are some outfits that are now trying to expand tourism into this area to make it a little, to demystify it a little bit and make it easier for people to understand the history, which is very important in these neighborhoods for the history of the city. One of the reasons for it is for their importance is that for a long time, this was the headquarters of Manuel Noriega, the dictator from several decades ago. And for a long time, it was home to gang wars, violent crimes, and even today, it's definitely a sketchy area, particularly at night, and particularly for non-locals who might not know how to behave and would stand out more than the locals would. It is slowly changing, though, and you will see a little bit of gentrification starting to work its way in around the edges. On the edge is actually a very lovely park. This is the charming Plaza Santa Ana that has locals with their old guys reading newspapers, people pushing their kids in strollers. There's a very pretty church. It's a shady park. And it's just kind of a nice place to hang out. It's a poor neighborhood. There's no question of that. Panama is one of the least, I should say, the most unequal, economically unequal countries in Central and South America, but this is still a very thriving neighborhood. In fact, looking out onto this plaza is one of the most popular restaurants. It's the oldest restaurant in the entire city, the Cafe Coca-Cola. It's a great place to grab. For only a few dollars, you can get a really delicious meal of all kinds of local specialties. Another interesting tidbit about it is the only restaurant in the world that is legally allowed to use the word Coca-Cola, the name Coca-Cola in the name, which is kind of interesting. So I took a walking tour for, I think it was like 20 or $30. We spent a couple hours on a Sunday afternoon just wandering around. These guys have started a walking tour company where they try to take foreigners on to experience the history and also what it's like to live in this neighborhood now. This guy who owns the company actually doesn't speak any English, so he brings along this 20-year-old kid who spoke very good English as a translator. And we had a great time. I was the only one on the tour, so it was just the three of us wandering around. And I got to see the neighborhood as the locals do. So there's a mix of buildings and styles, a lot of it in need of renovation and TLC. Part of that is because much of this neighborhood was destroyed during the bombings and attacks during the U.S. invasion in 1989, where our government went in to get Noriega. Um, that was a very difficult time period, and the locals still there is definitely still a lot of uncomfortable relations with the U.S. government, perceptions of the U.S. government because of that time, because a lot of innocent civilians were killed during that time. But there's a lot of vibrant street art that you can see, artsy graffiti and murals, and just a lot of fun buildings where markets, stores, barbershops, cafes. It was a great way for me to explore a neighborhood I would probably not have explored on my own, and also to go into a lot of shops. My Spanish is really not good at all. So it was good to go with some people who could. I ended up having some great conversations with storekeepers and locals just to get a sense of what it was like to live there now. It's actually quite an interesting neighborhood. This is a good example of the area where you can see the gentrification slowly working its way in from Casco Viejo. But still, there's a lot of poverty. The roosters that you can see on this balcony above the sidewalk are used for cockfighting, which is still pretty popular in this neighborhood. Um, there are some beautiful cemeteries on the far side of the neighborhood. This one on the right is specifically just for children. Only kids are buried here. And on the left is a cemetery only for Chinese. There were a number of Chinese workers who were brought in to work on the canals construction and at other times during the history of the country. But the neighborhood is changing. There are signs of life and modernization. There's a recently built new football pitch, so the kids are playing soccer and all the families are watching. Sunday afternoon was kind of a good day to be there because it's a very relaxing time where people are out with their families. The weather was nice. So I actually thought it was a great experience, and I would recommend it if you're there. I don't know if I would wander this neighborhood on my own, but I think it was well worth the experience to learn a little bit about what the what modern life in Panama is like. As you can see from some of these other photos, there's a mix of poverty and gentrification pretty much side by side. So it's an interesting and very changing neighborhood. Um, Heading the other direction, I'll take you a little bit down the Cinta Costera, which is that promenade that I mentioned. It was built in the last, I don't know, 10 or 20 years at a cost of about $190 million. And it extends most of the way along the coastline. Part of it curves around the old town, but then, and this is that elevated causeway where you can see some nice plantings and palm trees, cycling. There's a cycling route and also for pedestrians. The only bad thing about it is there's not a lot of shade. So if it's a very hot day, I did it on a day that had a little bit of cloud, which was nice because it wasn't too hot. They even have these weird little floating platform parks where they sometimes have activities and events. But there's a really nice view back to the city and to Ancon Hill, which we'll see shortly. So this promenade continues all the way along the seafront. There are vendors that sell food and cold drinks. There's wonderful places that you can take a selfie in front of with the city as a backdrop. I should point out, and you can see in this picture, there's this weird curved skyscraper off in the distance, and I'm pointing that out because it used to be the Trump Tower. There was a fancy hotel there. It has since changed its name because the Panamanians are not big fans of Trump. It is now a Marriott hotel, and it's a mix of hotel rooms and also condominiums. This photo is a little misleading because just because of the distance we are. It is actually the tallest building in Central America. It looks short because it's off in the distance, and these other buildings in front look taller, but it actually is when you get up close to it, it's the tallest building anywhere at 284 meters. And it's in a very exclusive enclave of wealthy Panamanians who can afford to live in fancy condos. Note again the immense number of Panamanian flags, but it's a great place to stroll. You can rent bicycles, um, four-wheelers, two-wheelers, whatever you want, or you can stroll. There are monuments along the way. This is to Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the Spanish explorer who was the first European to cross the isthmus and see the Pacific. But it's a fun place for locals and tourists alike to just kind of hang out, grab some street food, get some nice photo ops, look at the architecture. The new city is made up of a number of different neighborhoods, Bella Vista, El Cangrejo, Marbella. A lot of them are known as places for tourists to stay, and it is a good place to stay if you're planning to visit there. But you're more likely to end up in one of these very tall skyscraper hotels, or some of them have housing and apartments, some of them have offices. There's some interesting buildings like these. There's a few that are like this one that's kind of but ugly. It's a mix. By far the most distinctive building on the skyline is this one, which is called El Tornillo, which means the corkscrew in Spanish, for obvious reasons. And there's a few interesting historic sites. There's a couple of museums and some noteworthy churches, although these are not old compared to the old city. The one on the left is the Shrine of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which was built in the 1940s. It's much newer than it looks. The same with the church on the right. This Gothic Iglesia del Carmen was also built in the 1940s, but they're very beautiful. Here's a side view of that church. And it's an interesting part of the city to explore. This neighborhood that sticks out into the ocean, a little peninsula, is one of the chic, very expensive enclaves that has a forest of modern condominiums right on top of the ocean. I did find this kind of interesting. I was strolling along and saw a whole bunch of raccoons, which turn out to be invasive in Panama. These are the same kind of raccoons we have here in the United States. And they're probably best to stay away from because they can be kind of nasty, but they're looking for food, and they probably it's surmised that they came at some point on ships from some other location, and now they're endemic in the city, and you see them all over the place, which is kind of funny. Back in the old town, I wanted to show you a few images of what the place is like at night, because as the sun goes down and the lights come on, it's a beautiful area to stroll around in the evening. There's a lot of nightlife. The restaurants open up. The lights of the new city light up. Dazzling views of all those skyscrapers, and that elevated causeway actually has the red, white, and blue of the Panamanian flag. The lights change every few seconds, so you can see it turning red, white, and blue. I was there when the moon was up, and a beautiful view of the planet Venus over the city. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, particularly if you're in the old city, it's a very safe area to walk around. So being outside at night is not a problem. And you get to see all the monuments. This particular one here is a monument to the builders of over many decades, various famous people who were involved in the building of the Panama Canal. And there's some very fancy hotels, like this one, which has rooms that jut out over the harbor. And of course, they light up a lot of the churches at night too. This is that one of the first churches I showed you. Actually, no, take it back. This is the cathedral, and the main plaza where they have the bandstand and some other hotels. And the municipal building was very patriotically lit up in the red, white, and blue colors. The church tower that we climbed a little bit earlier. And this is the very first church I showed you, the Church of La Merced, all lit up at night. I never found out what this building was. This was not only about 5 minutes from my hotel. It's a wonderful Art Deco theater in very nice shape. It looks like it's been restored, but it is no longer used as a theater as far as I can tell, and I was unable to find out what it is used for. It may be in the process of being transferred from one owner to another. I don't know. But it was a very good example of the kind of 20th century building that has turned up in the city. I want to take you out of the city a little bit too. And the first place we're going to visit is Ancon, which is this bump very close to the city, right behind the old city and the El Chorillo neighborhood. For a very long time, it was under U.S. control because it was part of the Canal Zone. It has amazing views out over the city and out towards the Amador Causeway, which we're going to visit in a little bit too. There's a paved road that leads to the top. There are some hiking trails too, but you can just walk up a paved road to the top. And if you don't walk through the dangerous neighborhood, which is probably not recommended, it's very easy to take an Uber or a taxi for just a couple bucks, and it'll take you to the entrance. The other problem with walking there is that not only are you walking through kind of a sketchy neighborhood, but when you get close to the hill, there's actually a highway that kind of cuts off access to it. So it's not easy. There's only a couple places where you can cross the highway. So it's easier just to take a taxi for all of 5 minutes to get there. But you will be rewarded with a surprising amount of wildlife for a park that's like literally in the middle of the city. This is a sloth, which was right next to the street as we were walking up, just hanging out in a tree. There's some beautiful lush jungle foliage. You might see birds. I didn't see any monkeys, but you might see monkeys. And when you get to the top, there are beautiful views in all directions. This is looking back over towards the new city, the old city, which you can see here, and the causeway that surrounds it. All kinds of weird foliage and trees, giant leaves. And when you get to the very top, there is an enormous Panamanian flag, which they plunked there back in 1999 when this was transferred from United States control back to Panama. So it is kind of ironic that this park that is right in the middle of the city, up until very recently, and for basically the entire 20th century, Panamanians were not allowed there because it was part of the U.S. Canal Zone. So it was a big deal when it was transferred back to Panamanian control, turned into a public park, which all kinds of people visit today, tourists and locals alike. When you get to the top, you can look inland away from the coast, and you can actually see the beginnings of the Panama Canal here, looking over the cargo port of Balboa with the entrance to the canal. We're going to see this close up in just a sec when we take a boat through there. And you can actually look all the way up towards where the canal gets narrow to the Centennial Bridge, which is, I believe, the second of the bridges that was built across, the second of three that was built across the canal. We'll go under that in a little bit. And looking out towards some of the islands that are just off coast. Another place to visit, if you don't have a chance to explore other parts of the country, but you want to get a little sense of the nature that's in Panama, very close by, about 15 minutes from the center of town, is another big park, even bigger than Ancon Hill, called the Metropolitan National Park, about 300 hectares of hiking trails on a good-sized hill where you can explore some wonderful trails, get amazing views, and very likely see quite a bit of wildlife. sloths, monkeys. Um, these are not quite the most exciting thing to see, but I found them fascinating. These are leafcutter ants. If you've ever watched nature documentaries, you've probably seen people like David Attenborough explaining how leafcutter ants chop their little leaves, they take them back to their nests. Um, and I sat and watched them for like 15 minutes going back and forth. Um, and in Panama, actually, not just in Panama, in this particular park, which is not that large, there are 284 plant species, 227 bird species, and 45 different species of mammal, just in an area that's, the size of, oh, well, for those of you who are in the Boston area, it's roughly the size of the Lynn Woods. Um, and so it's quite an amazing place to be so close to the center of a major city. So there are shady hiking trails, and when you get to the top, there are fine views over the city, which is only about a couple miles away through the jungle. These weird things in the trees are actually ants' nests. Different species of ants build different kinds of nests in the trees. And you'll see tropical jungle flora like fig trees, like you can see here. I got lucky and ran into some coatis, which are related to raccoons, although these are native to Central America. They're not invasive, and they climb trees and they eat fruit and insects. They dig in the ground and forage for insects, and they're not terribly afraid of humans. So you're likely to be able to get up close to them. Something that is more afraid of humans are agoutis, little cat-sized rodents. They're kind of like they look very much like guinea pigs, except with very long legs. But they're very shy. I did see several of them, but they run like the dickens in the underbrush. So the closest I could get was this dark blob here, which you can pretty much not see in my photograph. That's an agouti. There were a couple of them running through the underbrush. But I love the views back over the city from the very highest point in the park. Here you can actually see the cathedral spires in the old town. There are some ponds and lakes also where you can see things like turtles. So if you don't have a chance, if you're really spending most of your time in the city, but you'd like to get out and see a little bit of the nature, these both Ancon and this metropolitan park are very easy to get to, and offer a really good way of seeing kind of a microcosm of the biodiversity of the country. Back in town, I treated myself to a fancy restaurant. This is that Plaza Bolivar where I had a delicious salad with fruit and feta cheese and a fish dish that was served kind of over. This was kind of like polenta, with a wonderful cream sauce on top of it. And of course, a mojito. I'm a big fan of mojitos. Another place that you must visit if you're in the city is just east of the canal entrance is a group of islands. You can see them here, um, that were originally entirely separate from each other and from the mainland, but were over the course of the 20th century, they were connected via a causeway to the mainland with fill from the excavation of the canal. So over time, a lot of the fill that came out of the construction was extended out a good 3 miles from the coast all the way to the end, which connected the islands to each other and connected it also back to the mainland. It's now called Amador, which is named after the very first president of independent Panama when it got its independence from Colombia in 1904. This was another one of those areas that, like Ancon, was part of the canal zone and was off limits to Panamanians until 1999 when it was returned to Panama control. And now it's become a very popular tourist area. We're going to visit both the Biomuseo and the Nature Center, but there's also marinas and restaurants, and the causeway itself is also a nice place to go biking and walking, and it has amazing views back to the city. Not a lot of shade, Um, so on a hot day, I'd be sure to take some water. Um, it also has some very nice monuments. This is one to the workers who built the canal. There's also a monument here called the Friendship Monument that celebrates the uh, canal treaties of 1979 under this is Jimmy Carter and then President Omar Torrijos at the time, who signed the treaties. It's worth noting an interesting historical tidbit that I did not know until I went to Panama and started doing a little bit of research. Um, Carter gets either the credit or the blame, depending on which perspective you have, on returning to the canal to Panamanian control. But actually, the impetus for making that change actually started earlier under the Nixon administration with Nixon and Kissinger, who at that time had kind of determined that with the changing economy and the changes in the 20th century, the canal was not as quite as strategic as it used to be, and it all came to fruition under the Carter administration, but it wasn't exclusively his idea. It took a number of years to build up to that. A very popular site to visit, particularly if you have kids with you, is the Bio Museum, which is only about 10 years old. It was built fairly frequently and was designed by the architect Frank Gehry, which you can probably tell just by looking at it. It's his first commission in Latin America, so you can see why it's a kind of odd assemblage of different things. But it's a great museum it's a science museum, but it has a lot of things that are really great for kids, but it's for all ages, and it celebrates the enormous biodiversity in Panama. I loved this big sculpture, which is life-size um, life-size sculptures of prehistoric animals that would have lived in Panama long before humans were here. And I was there, of course, when there were lots of school groups visiting because it was a great place for them. They even have a nice, small but very nice aquarium that has all kinds of things local to the ocean, both the Caribbean and Pacific sides of Panama. And there's also a lot of stuff that you can just see walking around. There are plenty of seabirds to see, um, not in the museum, but just flying around the area. There's pelicans all over the place. The frog actually is one of those little poison frogs that was in a display in the aquarium. But it's definitely a highlight if you're interested in science and nature, and particularly if you have kids with you. They also have a very pleasant garden behind it that has views towards the entrance to the canal, where you can see the Bridge of the Americas. I mentioned earlier there are three bridges now over the canal. This was the first one, built in 1962, the very first bridge to cross the canal that allowed you to connect from one side of Panama to the other without a boat. And again, beautiful views back to the city. Further west, way off in the distance, you can see that big skyscraper kind of building is a luxury hotel. That's the Westin, which has its own private beach, and it's a beautiful luxury place just outside the city. But the things that you can see in front, these weird little pylons, are all that's left of a quarantine building from many decades ago in the early 20th century during the construction and afterwards. If you know anything about the history of the canal construction, you know there were many people died, many workers died from yellow fever and malaria primarily, along with other things. And there were quarantine stations set up back when, at that time, these were islands. There was no causeway connecting them. So this was a quarantine station. The only thing that remains now are the foundations. But it's a beautiful area to walk around. You can take a cab or you can walk if you're up for it. And you'll see lots of bird life. This is a great-tailed grackle, similar to the grackles that we have here in the U.S., but with a much prettier song. Also, a lot of frigate birds. This is a female frigate birds. Female frigate birds have a white underbelly, and the males have a red one. I didn't see any males for some reason, but the males are known for their the red pouch underneath their necks, which they can inflate into a like a big balloon, and they use that to attract the females. But I didn't get to see any of those. And way out on the tip, there's also another nature center, which is well worth visiting, the Punta Culebra Nature Center, which is not terribly large, but surprisingly impressive. And they have an incredibly friendly and helpful staff that will tell you everything you want to know, answer all your questions, and more than a few sloths in the tree. Here's one. They have a butterfly uh, dome where you can see all different kinds of butterflies. They have a tropical frog house. It's a really nice place to visit and learn about the natural diversity of Panama and also get amazing views out over the Pacific. I stopped in a restaurant also out there because I was hungry. This is actually owned by a Greek. There were actually a good number of Greeks who came in the early 20th century to work on the canal construction, and their descendants, along with Portuguese, and there were Italians. Those were the main, and some Spanish. Those were the main European um, groups that came to work on the canal, and their descendants still live in Panama today. So this was a really good restaurant that had sort of a fusion of Panamanian cooking with Asian style cooking. On the right is a kind of tangy chicken soup, very delicious soup with lime. And on the left is fish with a ginger sauce, very sweet and sour sauce with, again, those plantain chips. And I discovered that I really like pisco sours, which is from either Peru or Chile. And I that's my new favorite drink. I need to learn how to make them here. Um, Looking back, but we have to talk about the canal. And I'll spend the rest of the program taking you through the canal and talking a little bit about its history. You pretty much cannot go to Panama City without seeing the canal and making a trip to it. There are different ways that you can do that. You can either take a boat trip, or you can take a tour that will take you on the lake, or at least to see the locks, even if you don't actually go through the canal. Of course, so much of the history of Panama is connected to and revolves around the canal. The 60-second history is roughly this. In the mid 19th century, probably around the 1840s, the Americans built a railroad, and the railroad went from the port of Colon, more or less followed here. You can actually see the railway line, which still exists, and connected it to Panama City on the West Coast, on the Pacific side. The railroad was built by the Americans and was very important at that time because it was a way, pre-canal, it was a way to really the only way to transfer people and goods from one side of the isthmus to the other. It also became very crucial during the California Gold Rush, when people wanted to go from the East Coast to the West Coast to seek their fortunes, and once they were there, they wanted to return to the East Coast with their money or their gold. And the railroad was the primary way of doing that. 20, 30 years later, the French decided to build a canal. And they used Fernando de Lesseps, who was so famous for having succeeded with the Suez Canal in Egypt. But unfortunately, it ended in failure for a number of reasons. Part of it was money. A lot of it was money, actually, getting investment. And some of it was simply the geography and the engineering aspects of it. So it kind of ended in failure, although they built a lot of the infrastructure, the buildings, and the engineering studies that the Americans were able to make use of another 20 or so years later, after the turn of the 20th century, when they started construction in 1903, lasted about 10 years. And what they decided to do was build. There was actually a lot of controversy over whether to build the canal here in Panama or whether to build it in Nicaragua, where you may know there is a very large lake, and in theory, it might have been a little bit easier to build there. Um, the problem with Nicaragua was, however, there were no ports, while in Panama, there were already two very good-sized cities, port cities, at the end of where the canal would be built, which was an advantage. The other thing is Nicaragua has a lot of earthquakes and a lot of volcanoes, which make it a much less stable place to build this kind of infrastructure. So it was ultimately decided to build here. And what they did is they dammed the river, the Chagres River, which comes from way up in the mountains, comes down here and eventually works its way out to the Caribbean Sea. They built a dam, which created this enormous lake, Gatun Lake. And then that lake is a good 80 to 90 feet higher than the sea level on either side. So what was necessary was to build locks, which on this side raise you up, and on this side bring you down to the back to the Pacific Ocean, or the other way around, depending on which direction you're headed. The railroad still exists, and it still moves some cargo and indeed some passengers. I would highly recommend either taking a land tour, which will take you to the locks where you can see how ships go through the canal, or even better, take a boat tour. These are the new Agua Clara locks, which were built over the last 10, 15 years or so. And we're looking out over Gatun Lake, which is that enormous lake that was created by the dam. The advantage to the lake is that much of the crossing for a ship that takes 10 or 12 hours to transit the isthmus, much of that crossing is actually just on open water on this lake rather than going through locks. Panama, in the last 10 or 15 years, built entirely new and duplicate sets of locks parallel to the old ones at a cost of something like $5 billion. And the reason for that is that the old canals, the old locks that were built in the first century, the first decade of the 20th century, were too small for many of the ships that are traveling around the world today. So the new locks are bigger. They're more environmentally friendly in the sense that they recycle their water. And it's a great place. If you go to the visitor center, you can see the container ships going through. We're actually now very close to the Caribbean Atlantic side. And this is the third of the three bridges that I mentioned. This is called the Atlantic Bridge for obvious reasons, and it was built very recently, only in 2019. And that goes over the canal right at the Caribbean Sea. But it's fascinating to watch the ships go through. Every ship that transits the canal has to have canal employees on board, and they don't go through under their own power. They are actually taken through either on tugs or on the old locks. They are actually pulled along with derricks that you'll see when I show you that. An entire transit takes about 10 or 12 hours. This is Gatun Lake again, that was created by the damming of the river. And at the time that it was created, it was the largest artificial lake anywhere in the world. There's a couple now that I think are bigger. But these are the Agua Clara locks you can see were built in 2016. The control tower is here, much more recent and very advanced. One of the things that these new locks do that is a significant improvement over the old ones is that the enormous amount of water that it takes to fill up the locks so that to change the water level. On the old locks, that water is lost. On the new locks, it is recycled, not entirely, but roughly 60% of the water is reused. So it's more environmentally friendly than the older locks. Here's a better view of this is the Caribbean side with the port city of Colon. And you can see the older locks here, very narrow, and immediately parallel to them are the big new locks. And we're going to take a quick side trip. This is the Chagres River where the dam is located, and the Chagres River still continues out to the Atlantic Ocean where there's a historic Spanish fort that you can visit. That's worth it. It allows you to go over the bridge, which is very impressive. And you can also see the dam, which is about 2 miles from the river mouth on the Caribbean Sea. The dam was built in 1913 towards the very end of the canal's construction, and gradually it built up this enormous lake. And the level of the lake is now roughly it varies with the season, roughly 80 to 90 feet higher than the sea level on either side. It also provides the water for the operation of the locks, which is very important. This is that fortress I mentioned called Fort San Lorenzo, right at the mouth, built by the Spanish about 1600 or so. And then, if you remember Henry Morgan, I mentioned him earlier, the pirate who burned down the original settlement, he plunked himself here for a while as a base when he attacked the city of Panama. But if you're into historic military architecture, it's a very well preserved fort. It's been added onto and changed through different time periods, but it's still in excellent shape. And the location is just beautiful because it's right over the Caribbean Sea on a high on a bluff over the mouth of the river. This is looking back up the river. This is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Again, down below, kind of, we're up high on the bluff where the fort is located, and down below, next to where the river mouth is, there was originally a small settlement, but they relocated everybody, along with many other small village settlements of local indigenous people who lived in the area that the lake has now submerged. Um, you can also stop in Colon, which is not one of the highlights of Panama, unfortunately, which is kind of a shame. It's Panama's second city, although much smaller than the capital. It's only about 250,000 people. And it was founded in the 19th century as the Atlantic end of that railroad, connecting the Atlantic to Panama City on the Pacific side. However, it has higher crime rates. The city is certainly hasn't had as much money put into it as the capital has, and it's kind of the forgotten city of Panama, which is a shame because it's a beautiful location. It does have some nice old architecture, but there's very little for tourists there. The one thing that is there is a big new cruise port for cruise ships. That are either transiting the canal or going around the Caribbean. And there's a big duty-free mall. And it gives you a good opportunity to see the major cargo port also there. I was there I had a guide who took me there, and because it was just me, I was the only one on the tour. So it was just me and this guy, and we had a great day. We just drove around and looked at stuff, and so we wandered around Cologne a little bit. The thing I liked the most about Cologne was they have the thing to do there is they've acquired a whole bunch of old, decrepit yellow school buses from the United States, which they have converted, painted all kinds of elaborate colors with graffiti. Some of them have even been tricked out with stuff like this. And these are now the main public transit for getting around the city of Cologne. It's kind of funny. Um, but the city really is on it. It's fallen on hard times. This is the cathedral, which is a beautiful building, but it's in deplorable shape. And I think Cologne has a lot of potential, but if you're a tourist, you probably aren't going to spend any time there. If your cruise ship stops there, if you're traveling there on a cruise ship, you're most likely to ignore the city entirely and use it as a base for taking tours to visit the canal or the forts and the area around it. Um, I have absolutely no idea what a mini super mega William is, but Cologne has one. But it was kind of nice to see a definitely not gentrified part of the country. But overall, it was kind of sad, and you could easily skip it. Back home in the old city, I tried a different restaurant. This is a fantastic Peruvian restaurant. I had to have, of course, another pisco sour, some delicious ceviche, and a sort of fusion. This was more Peruvian Asian fusion, which was absolutely outstanding. But back to the canal, we're going to finish the program by taking a trip through the canal. You can take a variety of different boat trips to get us to actually go through the locks and see what the canal is like. You can take what's called a full transit, which will go all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Um, or, which is what I did, is you can take what's called a partial transit, either from here to the middle or from the Atlantic side to the middle. The full transits are fairly expensive and also only run about once a month. So you may not get a chance to do that. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think it's necessarily necessary. It may be more canal experience than you really need. So what I did is I took one from here and we went through two sets of locks and then ended up in Gamboa, which is right where the Chagres River comes down, and then took a bus back to the city. And that took about 6 to 8 hours. The only disadvantage to it is you have to get up at the crack of dawn. So like 5 o'clock in the morning, this is out on the causeway. But the good thing is, again, we got to watch the sun rise east over the Pacific Ocean. And then on the boat, we came around that big breakwater with a beautiful early morning view of the city. We followed an empty oil tanker. You can tell it's empty because of how high it's riding in the water, underneath the Bridge of the Americas. And you get really good close-up views of the cargo port, where the container ships have enormous cranes and derricks that lift the zillions of containers and either are loading or unloading ships. We also paralleled this ship called the Iris. This is a brand new, literally brand new. I think it was inaugurated in this past December. It is one of the largest container ships in the world. It's a new generation of cargo ships. It's not actually the largest. There are some that are a little bit bigger, but this one carries. If I asked you to guess, you would come nowhere near close. This particular container ship can hold 16,000, not 100,000 of those 20-foot long containers, storage containers. It is far too big to go through the old locks, so it goes through the new ones. We went through the old locks. The boat that I was on was kind of, probably 100 feet long. It was the size that you might take to go on a whale watch or something like that. But we went through the canal right behind this oil tanker ship. And it's amazing to see how the locks actually work. We went through two sets, the Miraflores locks and the Pedro Miguel locks. You would think it would take a very long time, but the gates which you can see here, take only about maybe 4 or 5 minutes to completely close. So then the ship is enclosed within the lock, and then maybe 15 minutes or so to either raise or lower um, the water level, which is probably about anywhere from 30 to 40 feet, depending on the time of year and the lock. So it really is quite incredible how quickly the amount of water is added or removed to the lock. And this is what it looks like when it's raised. And then the other end of the lock opens and you move into the next one. Um, uh, in this program, I've often been asked how much it costs for a ship to travel through the canal, and the charges vary, as you might imagine, depending on what kind of ship, what size of ship. So whether the ship is full or empty. So you have cruise ships with passengers. You have oil tankers that may be full or empty. You have container ships that are all different sizes. You have liquid natural gas tankers going through, and you have smaller boats like the one that I was on. That's just a tourist boat taking people on trips through the canal. The one that we were on, which, as I said, was I forget how big, probably around 100, 125 feet long, small tourist boat. That cost the fee for the canal, the toll, to go partway through the canal and then to reverse and go back out was $3,000, according to the guide on the boat. The enormous container ship that I showed you a couple of minutes ago would cost anywhere close to $1 million. And that might seem like an incredible amount of money, but when you realize that instead of taking 10 to 14 days to go all the way around South America, the cost of doing that, if you do that, not only does that take a significant amount of time, but you're paying for the fuel to take an enormous trip. You're paying the workers on the ship, the salaries of the workers. You're having to stop at various ports to take on supplies and pay port fees. And of course, if you travel around the very southern tip of South America, it can be a pretty dangerous area for ships to be in. So it is well worth it to pay the fee to cut through the canal, and that's why a significant number of ships do it. Here, actually, I can show you these are tugs that take some ships through, and I mentioned earlier on the old canal locks, there are these little tram that guide the ship through, and it's amazing how close they come. There's barely a few feet between the sides of the ship and the sides of the canal. And this is again on the other side. We paralleled that gigantic ship, so you'll notice it's quite a bit higher. The new locks and the new canal are actually built a good 10 meters higher than the old one, so that's why it looks like it's kind of hovering above us. The transfer of the canal, as I mentioned, was negotiated in 1979 under the treaties were finally signed under the Carter administration. And it wasn't eventually actually turned over officially to Panama until 1999. So the canal zone no longer officially exists, even though one good thing about having it been a canal zone that was under the control of the US government and the US military is that the surrounding area has not been developed. So it's actually extremely beautiful, pristine jungle all the way along the canal. And you go under the Centennial Bridge, which again was built in 2004, celebrating 100 years of Panama's independence. And you go through the very famous Culebra Cut, which was formerly called the Gaillard Cut, about 8 miles long and by far the most difficult part of the construction of the canal. The big problem with excavating here is that it kept falling in. There were landslides. Even after the canal was opened, there were landslides. And so it took a very long time to be able to reach what they call the angle of repose, which is where um, the slope of the land on landforms on either side of the water are such that landslips are unlikely to occur. But it's a very dramatic transit through that very narrow area where the uh, the mountains rise on very close by on either side. This is a closer view of that incredibly huge ship, and you also pass the mouth of the Chagres River where it enters into the lake. There's the railroad bridge is in the front, and there's a more recently built auto bridge in the past, in the distance rather. I got lucky with this photo. I just loved the idea that there was this yellow buoy and this tiny, this little kid who was wearing a bright yellow dress. So I highly recommend taking a voyage of that kind in some way to really experience the canal and learn about how it was constructed and see it in action. It's one of the world's modern engineering marvels. And then when you're done, you can go back and have delicious food. I had to have, of course, another mojito. And these tacos, these are actually tacos made with, instead of made with traditional tortillas, they're made with the kind of bao dough that Chinese bao bread, which was a little different and quite delicious, along with some lobster, pasta with lobster, and a second mojito. And I'm a sucker for profiteroles, which are one of my favorite French desserts, little puff pastries with ice cream and chocolate sauce. Although I have to admit, this sort of smear of chocolate over the plate was maybe not the best look, but anyway, it was delicious. So I'm going to end the program there, and I will stop my share and let's see if there are any questions. Feel free to pop any questions into the chat or get the chat here. Where is, I've lost the chat. There it is. What's the name of the hotel? You know, I forgot, but I can find out. And it was actually one of the less expensive hotels, and it was a great location. And I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I will let Robert know, and he can include it in when he sends out the follow-up email after the program tomorrow. Let's see. What happens to all the containers that are offloaded? That's, you know, I don't really understand how a lot of that works. It's the container ports are actually run by completely different companies than the canal. The canal is actually now run by an independent canal administrative agency, and it's uh, it's funded by the tolls. In fact, that's how they paid for all of the new construction that happened over the last 10 or 15 years, all the new locks. And it's independent of the Panamanian government, and it has its own board that own board of governance that manages it and sets the fees and so forth. The ports, however, at either end are managed by completely different places. And you may have heard in the news recently that the Chinese control the canal. Well, they don't. What they do have investments in is, along with any number of other countries, the there are Chinese and other international investors in the management of the port facilities, which is where they load and unload the cargo ships. Exactly how that works, I don't know. So I would have to look that up. But the when we went by on the ship, and you could actually see these enormous derricks lifting, um, uh, loading and unloading cargo ships with those containers. It was really incredible. But I don't understand how the logistics of how all that works. Um, Someone also asked how many days I recommend. I was there for 6 full days. It depends on how much you want to see. I think you can easily see the capital in 2, 3, 4 days, depending on how interested you are in various things. But I think it is well worth it to add on some time to be able to take. You could either rent your own car. Driving around Panama is actually perfectly easy. And if you wanted, you could rent your own car and visit a lot of these places on your own and explore some other areas. Or you can take day tours by, um, there are innumerable day trips that you can take to take you to the jungle and take you to the canals, depending on what your comfort level is of traveling independently, what your mobility level is, and so forth. There's all kinds of different ways that you can do that. Let's see. Um, Someone mentioned that the Panama Canal was the first transcontinental railroad. Yeah, you're right. It wasn't a very big transcontinental road, but it was still incredibly impressive engineering because as thin as this part of the Americas is, and it's why Panama is so important. Um, the difficulty of building anything through extremely humid, uh, dense jungle with all kinds of diseases. I would highly recommend if you go there or if you're just interested. There's a lot of different histories about the building of the canal. Probably the most famous one is the one by David McCullough, called "The Path Between the Seas," which focuses mostly on the time period of the 19th century and the construction up through World War One. But the whole history between the financing, the politics, the engineering, the support services, the exploitation of workers, most of whom were actually, we like to say that the United States built the canal. Well, yes and no. We were the ones who built the canal, but the actual mussels were mostly from Barbados and other islands in the Caribbean. And they were the ones who bore the brunt of the bad construction conditions and the high rates of disease and death. So it's a fascinating history. It really is incredibly fascinating. Mm, I see a couple of other interesting comments. Any other questions? I'm going to put again my email, as I always do. If anyone after the program's over has any questions for either about this program or anything in general, feel free to shoot me an email. And I love to talk to people, particularly if you've been to Panama or are thinking of going. I like to hear other people's experiences. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'm a librarian, so we find out if we don't know the answer.
Jeff, we had 4 more questions pop up in the Q&A box. So why don't you answer those 4 and then we'll wrap it up.
Why can't I see them? Oh, because I'm in the chat.
Yes, two different boxes. And I Zoom did an update a couple weeks ago, and now everything is in different.
Yeah, Zoom updated, and now I can't. Can you read them to me because I can't
Yeah,
find them?
no worries. An
Uh,
anonymous, and you touched on this a little bit, but an anonymous attendee asks, is English prevalent outside the tourist areas?
um, in the areas that I was, yes, but I was not. I was pretty much focused on being in the capital and taking uh, excursions near the capital. If you get way out into the provinces of Panama, I think you'll find it less so. But English was, most people began conversations with me in Spanish, and when it became immediately clear that my Spanish sucks, we lapsed into English. But as with any kind of travel, learning some basic phrases is always good. But most places I went to, restaurants, hotels, stores, tour guides, everybody spoke more than enough English that you would not have trouble getting around. I think if you were to go exploring small villages and offbeat destinations further to the east or west, it might be different.
Anne wants to know if Panama City has a library, and did you visit it?
You know, I would hope it does, but I never saw it. I would have visited it if I had found it, but I never ran across it.
And Patricia asks, is the water safe to drink, and is the street food safe to eat?
Yes and yes. My general rule of thumb, yeah, the water in Panama was fine for drinking. You'll find bottled water everywhere, but uh, in the capital, yes, if you're out in the provinces, it might be different, but in the capital, in any hotel or anything, yeah, tap water was fine. Street food is usually fine. My rule of thumb with street food anywhere is be careful of fruit unless it comes in its own peel and you peel it yourself. If it's cooked food, it's you're on the safer side. Um, eating eating peeled like fruit salads and stuff, I'm always leery of that on the street.
Yeah.
Like cut up fruit. It might be okay, but you never know. And when you're on vacation, you don't want to spend a lot of time in the bathroom, so just don't. But and all the restaurants were great. Panama has some amazing restaurants with all different price ranges and all different kinds of food.
Yeah. All right, so folks, let's give Jeff a big virtual round of applause for another great presentation. Jeff will be back with us in a couple of months. I know he has some travel he's doing, so we'll make sure to have him back in June or July, though. Folks, look for an email from me later today with a link to this recording, as well as information about some other upcoming virtual programs that might be of interest. I'll also include Jeff's email address and Instagram in case folks want to reach out. So thank you all so much, and don't forget to take the feedback survey. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks
Bye-bye,
for
Jeff.
joining me, everyone. See you next time.
Safe travels. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.